So, portents, breath, violent wind, fire, blood, smoky mist, they can sound a bit frightening given our current circumstances. And having anyone breathe on you these days is fraught with uncertainty, if not danger. We're supposed to keep our distance for safety's sake, and yet today, for many people, pain and anguish has driven many to throw caution to the wind and gather in public spaces to cry out. And the disciples were driven out from their close quarters, their spiritual quarantine, so to speak, into the crowded marketplace to witness God's Spirit to the people. Now, what they were doing was inherently dangerous, not because they feared the health consequences. They were just trying to spread a spiritual virus. But because the political and social consequences of their call would mean that they too had to face one of the most powerful and regressive forces of empire in history. They say history repeats, so I can't help but hear the anguished voice of George Floyd crying out for breath as onlookers pleaded for his safety and 3 policemen ignored his suffering. He's filled with new wine would be one excuse for the overreaction. That and underlying health conditions, their callousness and the history of racial double standards inflicted too often by police sent many grieving Americans into the streets in outrage. And in the days since, we have seen peaceful but angry protests morph into blood and fire and smoky mist as tear gas canisters rain down and violence erupts in our cities. Social distancing be damned for those who can't afford the luxury of watching it all unfold on their 60-inch flat screens, or for those whose history of feeling betrayed by their own country does not allow them to say tisk tisk as they sip their second glass of Chardonnay. I was looking forward to this Pentecost after our Ascension Feast reminder to look forward and not up, to follow the ultimate countercultural transgressor Jesus, so that his Holy Spirit would know whom to land upon and inspire as guides to the kingdom of heaven. But it seems some different spirits have taken hold in our midst, and we have a lot more to overcome if we're going to bring that kingdom about. I see a spirit of division that cannot accept Paul's wisdom that we're all members of one body. That spirit is undoing. I see a spirit of discrimination that causes authorities to stand mute and nonviolent when heavily armed white protesters storm government offices and scream unmasked during a pandemic into the faces of law enforcement officials, but who feel the need to pin a handcuffed, nonviolent, unarmed black man to the ground by the neck to show him who's boss. And I see a spirit of entitlement that allows a young white woman to break New York City's leash laws and then use her privilege to threaten a law-abiding, Harvard-educated bird watcher who happens to be a black man with police action because he asks her to follow the rules. Knowing, mind you, that as a black man, he's far more likely to end up like George Floyd or Philando Castile or Michael Brown or countless others. And I see a spirit of indifference by far too many with privilege and power to the plight of those from other cultures and races who face discrimination of every type, whether it's because of their perceived immigration status or national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And I see a spirit of cynicism in too many leaders that think that the way to secure favorable election results is to minimize participation, attack people's patriotism and their honorable service, their loyalty, and their faith. And I see a spirit of fear that has led others to abandon every value that puts them at risk of losing power. I see before us a spirit of despair that leads too many to ask, well, what do we have to lose? Things are not going to change. It leads the broken and the hopeless to rage and violence. It's at the root of the looting and the destruction that brings ever more disgrace and poverty to the communities that struggle the most, and more contempt from those whose privilege and power have shielded them from that same despair. Sounds to me like we have a lot of work to do. Because today, despite the intrusion of all these other spirits, we have the Spirit that Christ promised. And having that Spirit carries with it huge responsibilities. It can look fearful and unstable and out of control, but it isn't. The Spirit descending is not under our control. But being of God, it is pivotal in life. It drives us out of our isolated, fearful, and separate communities and into the marketplaces of the world to connect and communicate in new and never before imagined ways. And given the current limits placed upon us on how we navigate our social world because of the current health crisis, we're having to learn entirely new sets of communication skills. So we may as well be learning to communicate in the language of the Parthians, Medes, and Elamites. God, though, is equipping us for a future we did not imagine. And God is equipping the people we could not imagine, so that we might all be saved. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. On your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And then everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Paul reminds us today that part of the perceived chaos is actually due to the fact that we are not, nor should we be, all the same. Now, there are varieties of gifts, Paul writes, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Just because someone is not imitating you doesn't mean that they are out of step with God's plan. It means that God's plan for them includes other skills, attitudes, cultural expressions, languages, and looks. One of my most frustrating observations about the racism issue is that too many people think that racism is simply overt animus, hatred or cruelty toward a different racial or cultural group. But most people these days wouldn't dream of being overtly cruel or violent to someone of another perceived race without any other motivation. They would never say the N-word out loud. That's just for rednecks. But racism, along with other bigotries, is actually the simple assumption that your own racial identity and or the values and way of being in the world are the standard. I'm not a racist. It's just that if everyone only behaved and talked and seemed more like us, we wouldn't have any of these problems. But Peter, Paul, and Jesus are stressing in each of their teachings today that we are not to bring the world to us and our way of being. We are to go out into the world and bring Christ's Spirit so that everyone can have the peace of Christ incorporated into their way of being. And that means realizing that the gifts and the ways of others are not just a matter of choice. They've been given by the Spirit of God, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. And that means if we really want to get to a place where people are not driven into the streets by the spirits of anger and despair and discrimination, then we disciples have to be willing to reach out to the others or the foreigners in our midst, and with the spirit of vulnerability, learn their language so that we can understand their stories. Don't all of us not only ache to be heard, but to be understood? That's why Jesus taught his disciples with such patience, constantly repeating himself, forgiving their thick-headedness, assuaging their fears, and gently prodding them forward. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. Now, as is our practice on the Feast of Pentecost, we do our part to prepare and sustain ourselves as we join the disciples before us in the marketplace of ideas and values. And we once again recite the covenant made at our baptisms. And this covenant reminds us not only of our faith story, but of our futures. It reminds us that we, in all our diversity, belong to one family and one God, and that this family always has room for more members, known and unknown. And that is what allows us to shut out all those other spirits vying for our attention. And it allows us to work with direction, using our unique gifts. And it allows us to rest in peace. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.